It began with a dare. On the outskirts of Ashwood, nestled in the shadow of Black Pine Hollow, a small group of friends gathered for one final summer camping trip before life pulled them in different directions. There were 4 of them: Ellie, the quick-witted and skeptical leader; Luke, her adventurous yet cautious boyfriend; Sarah, the quiet observer with a sharp intuition; and Danny, the joker whose bravado masked a deep fear of the unknown. The Hollow was notorious, the subject of whispered tales about strange disappearances and eerie shadows that lingered far too long in the moonlight. "We spend one night in the clearing by the old ranger's cabin," Danny said, his flashlight creating dramatic shadows across his face. "If we survive, we'll be legends. If not..." He trailed off with a grin that didn't quite meet his eyes. Ellie rolled hers. "Come on, Danny. You sound like we're the stars of some B-grade horror movie. It's just a forest." Sarah spoke softly, her voice barely rising above the crackling of the campfire. "People say there's a reason the ranger station was abandoned." Luke tossed another log onto the fire. "And those people are superstitious. What's the worst that could happen? We hear some raccoons in the night." But as the flames danced higher, casting flickering light on their faces, even Luke's voice carried a note of hesitation. The Hollow had a presence about it, an oppressive quiet that swallowed the usual sounds of nature. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, unnatural stillness. Still, their pride wouldn't allow them to back out. By midnight, they had set up their tents near the derelict ranger's cabin, a squat, weathered building with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. The air was colder here, biting at their skin in a way that felt deeper than temperature alone. Ellie's flashlight beam traced over the structure, illuminating faded letters etched into the wood. "Keep out." "Charming," she muttered. Danny, eager to break the tension, rattled the padlock on the door. "Anyone want to see what's inside? Maybe they left some snacks." "Cut it out," Sarah hissed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "This place doesn't feel right." Luke tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, guys, it's just an old cabin. Let's tell some ghost stories and call it a night." They gathered around their lantern, the flickering glow carving out a fragile sanctuary in the encroaching dark. Ellie started with a story about a phantom hitchhiker, her voice steady but her eyes flicking nervously toward the tree line. Danny followed with a tale of a haunted hotel, though his usual bravado felt forced. When it was Sarah's turn, she hesitated, then began quietly. "My grandmother told me about this place," she said. "She grew up in Ashwood, said there was something wrong with the Hollow, something old and angry. People who stayed here too long disappeared, or they came back different." "Different how?" Luke asked, leaning forward despite himself. Sarah's gaze was distant. "She wouldn't say. Just that you shouldn't go looking for answers." Before anyone could respond, a sound cut through the night, a low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated in their chests. All 4 froze, their eyes darting toward the trees. The sound came again, closer this time, like the rumble of an earthquake buried in the earth. Ellie grabbed her flashlight, her hands trembling. "What was that?" Danny forced a laugh. "Probably just a bear, or a mountain lion." "Bears don't sound like that," Sarah whispered. The growl became a chorus, multiple voices blending into a chilling, otherworldly harmony. Shadows began to move within the trees, not the erratic flickers of leaves, but deliberate, purposeful shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk. The lantern flickered, and for a moment, the darkness pressed in so completely that they could barely see each other's faces. "Into the cabin!" Ellie shouted, her voice cutting through the rising panic. Luke kicked the door until the rotten wood gave way, and they scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind them. The growls continued outside, circling, probing. Ellie shone her flashlight around the room, revealing dust-covered furniture and a map pinned to the wall, its edges curling with age. "What the hell is out there?" Danny asked, his voice breaking. Sarah pointed to the map, her hand trembling. Scrawled in red ink across the center of the Hollow was a single word: "Don't." The cabin was silent, except for their labored breathing and the soft creak of the warped floorboards beneath their weight. Outside, the growls had subsided, replaced by something far more unnerving. Whispers. They were faint at first, just barely audible over the wind, but soon they grew louder, an overlapping chorus of unintelligible words. Each voice seemed to be coming from a different direction, surrounding the cabin like an invisible crowd. Ellie clutched the flashlight tightly, her knuckles white. "What's out there?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound composed. Danny pressed his back against the door, his usual bravado gone. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not normal." Luke moved toward the window, careful not to disturb the rotting wood. Peering through the cracks in the boards, he strained his eyes to see beyond the oppressive darkness. "I don't see anything," he whispered. "Just shadows. But they're not moving like they should." Sarah stood frozen in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself as though trying to hold something inside. Her eyes were locked on the map pinned to the wall. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Danny whipped around to face her. "You think we don't know that? The problem is we don't even know what it is, let alone how to get past it." Sarah didn't respond. She took a step closer to the map, her fingers hovering over the faded lines that traced the boundaries of the hollow. Something about the map was wrong, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The longer she stared, the more the lines seemed to shift, the ink pulsating faintly under her gaze. Luke turned from the window. "If we make a run for it, we might." A deafening bang cut him off as the door shuddered violently. Everyone jumped, their screams echoing in the confined space. Danny braced himself against the door, but it was clear the lock wouldn't hold for long. "It's here," he shouted. The whispers outside surged into a cacophony, louder and more chaotic. It was as though the voices were arguing with one another, a battle of wills playing out just beyond the threshold. Ellie pointed her flashlight toward the door, but the beam seemed to weaken, swallowed by an unnatural darkness that crept in through the cracks. Sarah spun around, her voice trembling but firm. "We can't stay here. It's trying to get in." "What do you suggest?" Ellie snapped, her frustration born of fear. "Run out there into—" "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, her voice rising. "If we stay, we're trapped." Another bang rattled the cabin, and a low, guttural moan seeped through the cracks, resonating like a funeral dirge. The shadows outside began to coalesce, dark tendrils writhing against the thin walls. Luke backed away from the window, his face pale. "It's not just outside anymore," he muttered. "It's in the walls." Danny's flashlight flickered and died, leaving only Ellie's dim beam to fend off the encroaching darkness. In the faint light, Sarah's eyes caught something in the corner of the room. A trapdoor, partially hidden beneath a tattered rug. "Over here," she called, pulling the rug away to reveal the door. It was heavy and splintered, its rusted hinges barely holding it in place. Danny hesitated. "And what if whatever's out there is worse than this?" Ellie grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the trapdoor. "Do you want to wait and find out?" The banging grew louder, the door to the cabin bowing inward under the force of whatever was outside. The whispers turned into guttural cries, a twisted symphony of rage and despair. Without another word, Ellie yanked the trapdoor open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading into the earth. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying with it the scent of mildew and decay. Luke grabbed the lantern and followed Ellie down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah and Danny were close behind, the sound of the cabin door splintering above driving them forward. As the trapdoor slammed shut behind them, the cries outside were suddenly muffled, replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sounds were their hurried breaths and the creak of the wooden stairs beneath their feet. The lantern's flickering light illuminated rough stone walls, etched with strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly as they passed. "What is this place?" Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. Ellie ran her fingers over one of the symbols, her skin tingling at the touch. "I don't know," she said, her voice tight. "But it's old. Older than the cabin. Older than the hollow." Sarah stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on a symbol near the bottom of the stairs. It was different from the others, larger, more intricate, and carved deeper into the stone. As she stared, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the symbol were looking back at her. "It's not just a hiding place," she said softly. "It's a trap." The air was heavy in the underground passage, damp with the scent of soil and decay. The stairs ended abruptly, opening into a cavernous chamber lit only by the flickering lantern in Luke's trembling hands. The walls were carved with the same eerie symbols, their faint glow casting shifting patterns across the space. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of dripping water and the faint echoes of their footsteps. Danny was the first to speak, his voice shaky but defiant. "Okay, I'm officially done with this. What the hell is this place?" Ellie's flashlight swept over the chamber, revealing fragments of wood and rusted metal scattered across the floor. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, cracked and weathered with age. Resting atop it was a small box, its surface covered in the same strange markings. "It's like some kind of ritual site," she murmured. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes locked on the box. "We shouldn't touch it," she warned. "This whole place, it's not meant to be found." Luke turned to her, his face pale. "Then why is it here? Someone built this. Someone left this." He gestured toward the box. "Maybe it's the key to getting out of here." Sarah shook her head vehemently. "Or it's what's keeping that thing out there from coming down here." A deep, resonant hum began to fill the chamber, vibrating through the stone walls and into their bones. It started as a faint tremor but grew steadily louder, pulsing like a heartbeat. The glowing symbols on the walls flickered, their light intensifying in time with the sound. Danny backed away, his hands raised. "No, absolutely not. Whatever this is, we're not supposed to be here." Ellie ignored him, stepping closer to the pedestal. Her fingers brushed the edge of the box, and the hum intensified, a low, guttural growl reverberating through the air. She jerked her hand back, her heart pounding. "It's connected to whatever's out there," she said, her voice low. "But I don't think it's keeping it out. I think it's calling it." Luke grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Then let's leave it alone and find another way out." Sarah turned toward the far side of the chamber, where a narrow tunnel disappeared into darkness. "There might be another way," she said, "but we have to hurry." The hum shifted, becoming a discordant wail that echoed through the cavern. The walls seemed to vibrate, the glowing symbols writhing as though alive. Ellie's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness. The only light came from the lantern, its glow barely holding the shadows at bay. Suddenly, a voice rang out, low and gravelly, speaking in a language none of them understood. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around them like a physical presence. Danny clutched his head, his knees buckling under the weight of the sound. "Make it stop," he shouted, his voice breaking. Ellie grabbed the lantern from Luke, her eyes scanning the chamber for anything that could help. Her gaze fell on the box again, and she felt an inexplicable pull toward it. "What if it's the only way to stop this?" she said, her voice trembling. "Or the way to make it worse?" Sarah snapped. "Ellie, don't." But it was too late. Ellie reached out and lifted the box from the pedestal. The wail stopped instantly, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. The glowing symbols on the walls dimmed, their light fading until they were barely visible. "Ellie," Luke said cautiously, his voice low. "What did you do?" Before she could answer, the ground beneath them began to shake. Cracks spread across the floor and a cold wind rushed through the chamber, carrying with it the stench of rot. The tunnel Sarah had pointed to earlier seemed to expand, the darkness within it alive with movement. "We need to go," Sarah said urgently. "Now." They ran toward the tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The wind grew stronger, tugging at their clothes and hair, as the whispers returned, this time louder, more insistent. Ellie clutched the box tightly, her knuckles white. As they entered the tunnel, the walls seemed to close in around them, the air thick and suffocating. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish with each step. Behind them, the wailing began again, louder and more furious than before. Luke glanced back, his heart pounding. "It's coming," he shouted. Danny stumbled, and Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. "Keep moving," she yelled. "Don't look back." The tunnel twisted and turned, the ground uneven beneath their feet. The symbols on the walls were gone now, replaced by jagged, claw-like marks that seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. Ellie's breath came in ragged gasps as she clung to the box, her mind racing. She didn't know what she'd unleashed, but she knew one thing: it wasn't going to let them leave easily. At last, they stumbled into another chamber, smaller than the first but no less eerie. In the center of the room stood a door, its surface carved with more of the strange symbols. Ellie stepped forward, the box in her hands glowing faintly as she approached. "What if this is another trap?" Luke asked, his voice shaking. Ellie didn't answer. She placed the box on the ground in front of the door, and the symbols began to glow brighter. The door creaked, the carvings shifting and writhing like living things. Slowly, it began to open. Behind it was nothing but darkness. The darkness beyond the door wasn't just an absence of light. It felt alive, a shifting void that seemed to pulse and breathe. The air grew colder, heavy with an almost electric tension. Ellie hesitated, her hands trembling as she stepped back from the door. The box on the ground began to hum softly, its glow pulsating in rhythm with the darkness. "What's behind it?" Danny whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Sarah stared into the void, her face pale but resolute. "It's not a place," she said softly. "It's a presence, and it's waiting for us." Luke tightened his grip on the lantern, its flickering light barely penetrating the oppressive gloom. "We're not going in there. There has to be another way out." Ellie looked at the box, its glow intensifying. "I don't think we have a choice," she said. "It's this or go back, and whatever's behind us isn't going to let us leave." The wailing from the tunnel had grown louder, closer, a cacophony of rage and despair that seemed to vibrate through their bones. Shadows began to creep into the chamber, long tendrils that writhed and twisted like living things. Danny stumbled back, his breathing ragged. "It's coming," he shouted. "We have to move." Without another word, Ellie stepped through the door, clutching the box tightly to her chest. The others hesitated, but the encroaching shadows left them no choice. One by one, they followed her into the darkness, the door slamming shut behind them with a deafening thud. The void swallowed them whole. The lantern's light snuffed out as though it had never existed. The air was thick and cold, pressing against their skin like a tangible force. Ellie's voice broke the silence, shaky but determined. "Keep moving. We can't stop." "What are we moving toward?" Luke asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Ellie admitted. "But this place, it's not endless. There's something here. I can feel it." As they moved deeper into the void, faint lights began to appear in the distance, pinpricks of pale blue that flickered like dying stars. The ground beneath their feet was smooth and cold, as though carved from obsidian. The whispers returned, faint and overlapping, their words unintelligible but filled with a haunting urgency. Sarah stopped abruptly, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Danny nodded, his face pale. "It's saying something, but it's not in English." Ellie strained to listen, the box in her hands vibrating softly. The whispers seemed to converge, their voices blending into a single word repeated over and over. "Release." Luke's voice was tight with fear. "Release what?" Before anyone could answer, the ground began to tremble. The lights in the distance grew brighter, coalescing into a massive, shifting shape that defied comprehension. It moved like smoke and shadow, its edges constantly shifting, its form too vast and alien to grasp. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the single word echoing in their minds. "Release." Ellie looked down at the box, its glow now almost blinding. She felt an overwhelming pull, as though the box was alive, urging her to act. "It wants me to open it," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't," Sarah cried, grabbing her arm. "You don't know what's inside. It could be worse than what's out there." Danny backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "Or it could be the only thing that saves us. We're out of options." The massive shape drew closer, its presence suffocating. Ellie's mind raced, the whispers filling her head until she thought she might scream. She glanced at Luke, his face pale and desperate. "What if this is the only way?" she asked, her voice cracking. Luke hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "If you think it's the answer, do it, but do it fast." With shaking hands, Ellie opened the box. The glow intensified, flooding the void with blinding light. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The massive shape recoiled, its shifting form collapsing in on itself as though being pulled into the box. The light consumed everything, and for a moment there was nothing but blinding whiteness. Then, slowly, the world began to return. The void faded, replaced by the forest clearing near the ranger's cabin. The four of them stood in the center of the clearing, the box still in Ellie's hands. The hollow was silent now. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. The air felt lighter, the shadows retreating to their rightful places. Ellie looked down at the box, its glow now dim and fading. "It's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with unease. "No," she said, "it's not over. We might have closed one door, but we opened another." Ellie looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. The box felt heavier in her hands, as though it carried more than its physical weight. She didn't know what they had released or what they had trapped, but one thing was certain: Black Pine Hollow would never be the same. As they walked back toward the edge of the forest, the whispers began again, faint and distant, a chilling reminder that some things are never truly gone. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the faint tang of pine and decaying leaves. A full moon hung low over Hollow Point Lake, its silvery reflection fractured across the water. 4 friends, Jess, Mark, Clara, and Ben, sat in a loose circle around a crackling fire, the embers rising into the darkened sky like fireflies. They had come here to escape the grind of their small-town lives, to relive the freedom they'd felt as teenagers. But now, in their late 20s, that carefree nostalgia seemed elusive, replaced by something heavier in the air. "Do you remember the stories about this place?" Mark asked, his voice low, eyes scanning the tree line. He was the type who thrived on tension, often steering conversations toward the macabre. They said people used to hear screaming at night, people disappearing, bodies found floating in the lake. "Cut it out, Mark," Clara said, shivering as she pulled her jacket tighter. She was always the skeptic, her dark eyes quick to roll at anything she deemed overly dramatic. "We're here to have fun, not get scared to death." Jess, the quietest of the group, stared into the fire. Her blonde hair fell in loose waves over her face, hiding her expression. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about this lake," she said softly, surprising everyone. She said there was a cabin in the woods nearby. People who stayed there didn't come back the same. Ben leaned forward, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and unease. "What do you mean, not the same?" Jess hesitated, her fingers nervously toying with the hem of her sweater. "She said it changes people. That something follows them back. My grandma always warned me to stay away from here." Mark grinned, sensing an opportunity. "Well, lucky for us, we're not in the cabin, are we? Just a good old-fashioned camping trip by the fire." He tossed another log into the flames, sending sparks into the air. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't quite a scream, but it wasn't the wind either. Clara froze, her eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the trees. "Did anyone else hear that?" "No," Mark said a little too quickly, though his hand hovered close to the flashlight lying beside him. "Probably just an animal." Jess didn't speak. She had heard it too, but it wasn't just the sound that unsettled her. It was the way the woods seemed to shift in response, the trees leaning in as though listening. The firelight didn't feel as warm anymore, and the shadows around them deepened, growing darker than they had any right to be. Ben stood abruptly. "I'm gonna grab some more firewood," he said, his tone light but his movements tense. "Anyone want to come with?" Mark shook his head, gesturing to his beer. "You've got this, man." "I'll go," Jess said suddenly, standing before anyone could object. She didn't want to stay by the fire, feeling exposed under the watchful gaze of the woods. They ventured into the trees, their flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. The air felt colder here, the smell of damp earth stronger. As they walked, Jess couldn't shake the sensation that they were being followed. She turned abruptly, shining her flashlight behind them. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. "You okay?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jess nodded but didn't speak. She didn't want to admit that she felt eyes on her, that the woods seemed alive in a way they shouldn't. They found a few fallen branches and began gathering them, working quickly to avoid staying too long in the oppressive darkness. Then Jess saw it, a structure half hidden by the undergrowth. Weathered wood and a sagging roof, its windows black and empty. The cabin. "Ben," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." He followed her gaze, his face paling as he saw it. "We should go back." But Jess couldn't move. She felt drawn to the cabin, as though it were calling to her, the shadows in its windows shifting like liquid. And then she heard it again, that faint sound, closer this time. A scream. Jess stood frozen, her eyes locked on the cabin. The scream had been faint, distant, but unmistakable. It echoed in her chest, vibrating through her bones. Beside her, Ben's breathing quickened as he grabbed her arm. "Jess, we're going back. Now." She hesitated, her gaze flickering between the cabin and the safety of the campfire in the distance. "It sounded like someone was in trouble," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ben tightened his grip. "It's just your imagination. Come on." His voice cracked, betraying his own fear. But as Jess turned to follow him, a soft whisper brushed past her ear, chilling her to the core. It wasn't Ben, it was something else. Words she couldn't quite make out, like the hiss of leaves in the wind. She whipped her flashlight around, the beam landing on the cabin's door. It had been closed before, hadn't it? Now it hung slightly ajar, the darkness inside like an open maw. "Jess, let's go." Ben's voice jolted her back to reality, and she allowed herself to be pulled away. They hurried back to the fire, the trees around them closing in as if reluctant to let them leave. By the time they reached the campsite, Jess's heart was pounding. Mark and Clara looked up from the fire, their faces illuminated by its orange glow. "What the hell happened to you two?" Mark asked, his usual smirk faltering when he saw their expressions. "There's a cabin," Jess blurted out, her words tumbling over each other. "We saw it. It's just through the trees." Mark raised an eyebrow. "The cabin? Seriously?" His skepticism was clear, but even he couldn't hide a flicker of unease. "Yeah, and we're not going near it," Ben said firmly. He dropped the firewood onto the ground and sat heavily on one of the logs, running a hand through his hair. Clara frowned, her brow furrowed. "A cabin? Like an abandoned one? That's weird." Jess hugged her knees to her chest, staring into the flames. It didn't feel abandoned. There was something wrong about it. Mark leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Wrong how? Like haunted wrong? Or serial killer wrong?" "Shut up, Mark," Ben snapped. "This isn't a joke." The tension in the group was palpable, the usual camaraderie replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted. Jess couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the woods themselves were leaning in closer with each passing second. A sudden rustling from the darkness made them all jump. Mark was the first to grab his flashlight, shining it toward the sound. A raccoon scurried into the underbrush, its eyes reflecting the beam before disappearing entirely. "Just a raccoon," Clara said, exhaling in relief. But the fear in her voice lingered. Jess, however, couldn't look away from the darkness. "It's not just the cabin," she whispered. "Something's out there." Mark rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. Now you're sounding like one of those cheesy campfire stories." "She's right," Ben said, his voice low. "It's not just in our heads. The woods, they're different here." The fire suddenly sputtered, the flames dimming as though suffocated by an unseen hand. The group exchanged uneasy glances as a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it that same faint whisper Jess had heard before. This time, it wasn't just her. They all heard it. "What was that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Wind," Mark said, though his grip on the flashlight had tightened. "No, it wasn't," Jess insisted, standing abruptly. "It's coming from the cabin. We need to leave. Now." Ben nodded, already grabbing his backpack. "She's right. We'll pack up and hike out. We're too close to whatever this is." As they began gathering their things, the whispers grew louder, shifting from unintelligible murmurs to something clearer, words that seemed to bleed directly into their minds. Stay with us." Clara dropped her flashlight, her hands covering her ears. "Stop it. Make it stop." Mark froze, his face pale. It's in my head." The fire extinguished entirely, plunging them into darkness. Jess clung to Ben's arm, her own flashlight flickering as the shadows around them seemed to thicken, pressing in like a living thing. And then, from the direction of the cabin, came a deep, guttural growl that made their blood run cold. "Run!" Jess screamed, and they did. Tearing through the woods in blind panic, the whispers and growls chasing them like a tide. But no matter how far they ran, the sense of being followed never left. Branches clawed at their faces and arms as they ran, the forest's darkness swallowing them whole. Jess stumbled but caught herself, Ben's firm grip keeping her upright. The whispers were louder now, weaving through the trees like tendrils, grasping for them. "Keep moving," Ben shouted, though his own voice was hoarse with fear. Clara was crying, her breaths hitching as she tried to keep pace. Where are we going? We're running in circles. Mark, normally the bravest or most foolish of them all, had fallen silent, his face pale as a sheet. We can't outrun it, he muttered, his flashlight beam shaking. It's not letting us go. The words hit Jess like a punch. He was right. No matter how far they ran, the same trees seemed to surround them, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. And then, just ahead, the undergrowth parted to reveal something impossible. The cabin. No, 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 Clara shrieked, doubling over as if her legs would give out. We ran the opposite way. Jess stared at the structure, her mind reeling. The cabin's door was wide open now, a faint, sickly yellow light spilling out. The air around it shimmered like heat waves rising off asphalt. The whispers grew into a cacophony, urging them forward. Mark dropped his flashlight, the beam illuminating the cabin's steps. "It's calling us," he said, his voice distant, detached. He took a shaky step toward it, his movements as though guided by invisible strings. "Mark, no!" Jess yelled, grabbing his arm. But his eyes were glazed, unfocused, and he yanked free with surprising strength. "We can't fight it," he said, his voice a monotone. "It'll be worse if we don't go in." Ben stepped between Mark and the cabin. "Snap out of it, man. We're not going in there." He shoved Mark back, but the moment he did, the ground beneath them seemed to ripple. Jess screamed as the forest itself twisted. Trees bent at unnatural angles, their bark splitting to reveal black, writhing veins. The ground beneath them grew soft like quicksand, pulling them closer to the cabin. "I can't move," Clara cried, her legs sinking into the earth. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and mocking. A voice rose above the chaos, smooth and cold, echoing from the cabin. "You came to us. Stay and you'll see the truth." Jess felt a pull deep in her chest, as though her very soul were being tugged toward the light spilling from the doorway. "Fight it," she screamed, though her own legs betrayed her, dragging her inch by inch closer. Ben grabbed a nearby branch, using it to anchor himself. "Hold on to me," he shouted. Jess reached out, clutching his arm with both hands, while Clara managed to grab his belt. Mark, however, stood still, his body slack as he walked slowly toward the cabin. "Mark," Jess shouted, but he didn't respond. His foot touched the first step, and the light seemed to surge, enveloping him. "No," Ben bellowed, letting go of the branch to lunge for Mark, but it was too late. The moment Mark crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang. The forest fell silent. The whispers stopped, the laughter ceased, and the oppressive pull disappeared. The air was still, the only sound their ragged breathing. "What just happened?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Jess stared at the cabin, her heart hammering. "He's in there," she said, her voice hollow. "We have to get him out." Ben shook his head vehemently. "No way. He walked in there on his own. Whatever that thing is, it has him now." "But we can't just leave him," Jess insisted, tears streaming down her face. Clara sobbed, sinking to her knees. "We're not strong enough. We'll die if we go in there." Jess clenched her fists, her mind racing. She couldn't abandon Mark, but the thought of entering that cabin sent icy tendrils of fear wrapping around her heart. The light in the cabin's windows flickered, as if mocking her hesitation. "We have to make a plan," Ben said, his voice low but steady. "We'll figure out what this thing is and how to fight it, but we don't go in blind, not yet." Jess nodded reluctantly, though every fiber of her being screamed to run into the cabin and drag Mark out. "Okay, but we can't wait too long. Whatever's in there, it's not gonna let him go easily." The three of them retreated a safe distance, setting up a small camp just out of sight of the cabin. The woods were eerily quiet now, as if holding its breath, waiting for their next move. As the night stretched on, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was watching them. And somewhere, in the back of her mind, the whispers began again. "Come back, see the truth." Jess awoke to the sound of whispers, low and insistent. They seemed to hum in her skull, wrapping around her thoughts like vines. The fire they'd built had burned down to embers, and Ben and Clara lay huddled in restless sleep. Jess sat up, her breath visible in the unnaturally cold air. The cabin's sickly yellow light still pulsed faintly through the trees. Jess's gaze locked on it, her chest tightening. The whispers grew louder, transforming into something almost human. "You're so close, come back." Jess shook Ben awake, her hands trembling. "We can't wait anymore," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We have to go back for Mark." Ben groaned, rubbing his eyes. Jess, it's suicide. We don't even know what's in there. Mark's in there, Jess snapped, louder than she intended. Clara stirred, sitting up with a groggy, tear-streaked face. What's going on? She asked, her voice cracking. Jess turned to her, determination hardening her features. We're going back. Mark needs us. Clara hugged her knees, shaking her head. I'm not going near that place. It's alive, Jess. You saw what it did. I saw it take our friend, Jess countered, standing and shouldering her flashlight. I'm not leaving him. Ben swore under his breath, rising to his feet. If you're going, I'm not letting you do it alone. Clara looked between them, her face pale. You're both insane. But if you're going, I'll come too. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. The trio approached the cabin, each step heavier than the last. The air seemed thicker here, pressing down on their lungs. When they reached the door, Jess hesitated, her fingers hovering over the worn wood. The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Together, Ben said, gripping her shoulder. Jess nodded, pushing the door open. The light inside was blinding at first, a sharp contrast to the darkness outside. As they stepped in, the door slammed shut behind them with a finality that made Clara gasp. The interior of the cabin was impossibly large, stretching into darkness that seemed to go on forever. The air smelled of damp wood and rot, and shadows flickered across the walls, their movements unnatural. Mark stood in the center of the room, his back to them. Mark, Jess called out, her voice echoing eerily. He turned slowly, his face eerily calm. You shouldn't have come, he said, his voice layered with something else, something ancient and cold. What are you talking about? Ben demanded, stepping forward. We're here to get you out. Mark smiled, but it wasn't his smile. His teeth were too sharp, his eyes too dark. There's no out. You've been chosen, just like me. The cabin called you because it knows your secrets. What secrets? Clara whispered, clutching Jess's arm. The shadows around them began to writhe, forming shapes, familiar shapes. Jess saw herself as a child, hiding under her bed as her parents screamed at each other. Ben saw the face of the man he'd left for dead in a drunken hit-and-run. Clara's reflection twisted into the image of her younger sister, whom she'd abandoned in a burning house. The shadows laughed, their voices overlapping. They know. They've always known. This isn't real, Ben growled, clenching his fists. This is some kind of trick. It's real, Mark said, his voice devoid of emotion. And it won't let you go until you accept it. The truth. Your truth. Jess's heart raced as the shadows closed in, whispering her darkest fears and regrets. She turned to Mark, tears streaming down her face. How do we stop it? You don't, he said simply. You give in, or you stay here, forever. Clara screamed as one of the shadows lunged for her, its inky tendrils wrapping around her legs. Jess and Ben tried to pull her free, but the shadow was too strong. Clara's screams cut off abruptly as she was dragged into the darkness, her body disappearing completely. No, Ben shouted, punching at the shadow, but it was useless. Jess turned to Mark, desperation in her voice. There has to be another way. Mark tilted his head, his dark eyes gleaming. Sacrifice. One of you stays willingly, the others go free. The cabin seemed to pulse, the shadows retreating slightly as if waiting. Ben looked at Jess, his jaw tight. No, there's no way we're doing that. Jess's mind raced. There has to be another way, she repeated, her voice breaking. Mark smiled faintly. You could try, but the cabin doesn't like defiance. The shadows surged again, and Jess knew they didn't have time. She grabbed Ben's arm, pulling him toward the door. We'll come back for Clara. We'll find a way to destroy this place. No one escapes twice, Mark said, his voice cold and final. The cabin shook violently as Jess and Ben reached the door. Jess turned back one last time, meeting Mark's gaze. His face flickered for a brief moment with something human, regret. Then the shadows consumed him, and Jess and Ben burst out into the forest. The night was eerily calm, the cabin nowhere to be seen. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. But as Jess looked up, she noticed something different about Ben. His shadow was wrong. Longer, darker, moving when he didn't. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the whispers began again. In the small, forgotten town of Whispering Pines, the air was thick with secrets. It was the kind of place where the past lingered like smoke, and every rustling leaf seemed to whisper tales of things better left unsaid. Located at the edge of a sprawling forest, the town was a patchwork of aging cabins, rusted mailboxes, and winding dirt roads that led nowhere. The forest, dense and brooding, was both a sanctuary and a prison, its ancient trees holding memories of generations long gone. Lucy Hart was an outsider. At 22, she had reluctantly returned to Whispering Pines, the town she swore she'd never see again. Her mother's sudden death had left her with no choice but to inherit the family cabin. It was a creaking, lopsided relic that seemed to exhale dust with every step she took inside. The smell of damp wood and forgotten time hung heavy in the air, but beneath her resentment lay a quiet guilt. Lucy had abandoned her mother and this town years ago, leaving behind unresolved whispers of an event she couldn't bear to confront. Her first night back, a storm rolled in, drenching the town in relentless rain. As thunder growled in the distance, Lucy sat by the fireplace, staring at a shoebox of her mother's belongings. Inside, she found a faded photograph of her as a child, standing in the forest with her best friend, Emma. Emma's face was partially obscured by a strange shadow, a smear that seemed to swallow her expression. Lucy's heart skipped. She hadn't thought of Emma in years, not since the day Emma had vanished without a trace. The next day, curiosity tugged at her like an unseen hand. She found herself wandering to the edge of the forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches gnarled and tangled as if trying to hold her back. Her breath hitched when she saw it. The old treehouse where she and Emma used to play. It was half collapsed, its wooden planks rotting and sagging. But something about it called to her, a faint echo of laughter that wasn't hers. "Emma?" Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. The wind seemed to answer, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded too deliberate, too alive. Lucy stepped closer, her footfalls muffled by the wet ground. That's when she saw it. A faint trail of footprints, small and childlike, leading deeper into the woods. Her pulse quickened. The prints were fresh. That night, Lucy's dreams were plagued by shadows. In one dream, she was a child again, running through the woods with Emma. But Emma's face was wrong, blurred and shifting, her eyes dark voids that swallowed the light. When Lucy woke, the whispers were still there, a murmur just below hearing. And then she heard it clearly, the unmistakable sound of laughter outside her window. Shaking, she crept to the window and peered out. The forest was shrouded in darkness, its edges illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. And there, standing at the tree line, was a figure. It was small, no taller than a child, and it waved at her with slow, deliberate movements. "Emma?" Lucy's voice cracked. The figure didn't move, but the laughter grew louder, echoing through the night. The laughter outside Lucy's window echoed long after the figure disappeared into the shadows. She sat frozen, her breath shallow, clutching the old photograph of her and Emma. A nagging thought scratched at the edges of her mind. How could it be Emma? She'd been gone for 15 years. But the laughter, the footprints, and the shadowy figure felt too real to dismiss as a nightmare. Morning came reluctantly, the sun hidden behind a shroud of gray clouds. Determined to shake off the eerie events of the night, Lucy decided to explore the forest. She told herself it was for closure, to finally face the memories she had buried so deeply. Armed with a flashlight and her mother's old hunting knife, she followed the path that led to the treehouse. The forest felt different during the day. The sunlight, weak as it was, struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows that danced on the ground. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made Lucy flinch, her grip tightening on the flashlight. As she approached the treehouse, she noticed something strange. The small footprints she'd seen the night before were still there, impossibly fresh. "What the hell?" she muttered, crouching to examine them. The prints seemed too defined, as if whoever or whatever had made them was just ahead. Her heart thudded in her chest as she rose and scanned the woods. "Emma, if this is some kind of sick joke, it's not funny." Her voice echoed, swallowed quickly by the forest's oppressive silence. But then a response came, a soft giggle, high and melodic, like a child playing hide-and-seek. It was coming from the treehouse. Lucy's stomach churned as she approached the decaying structure. The rope ladder hung limp, its fibers frayed and moss-covered. Climbing it felt like a gamble, but the pull to go up was irresistible, almost hypnotic. As she ascended, each rung groaned under her weight, threatening to give way. When she reached the platform, she froze. Inside the treehouse was a collection of objects that didn't belong. A rusted bicycle bell, a broken doll, a stack of faded Polaroids. Lucy picked one up, her hands trembling. The photo showed two children, herself and Emma, sitting in the treehouse, their faces smeared with dirt and laughter. But in the background, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was tall and angular, with impossibly long limbs and empty eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. A chill ran down her spine. No way. No way this is real. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath her creaked violently, and the entire treehouse seemed to shift. Lucy scrambled down the ladder, her heart pounding as she landed on the forest floor. The giggle came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps circling her. She spun around, gripping the knife tightly. "Who's there? Show yourself!" The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. Then she saw it, a figure peeking from behind a tree. It was small, no larger than a child, but its features were wrong. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow sockets that seemed to pull the light from the forest. Lucy's legs felt like jelly as the figure stepped closer. It didn't walk so much as glide, its movements unnaturally smooth. "Emma?" Lucy whispered, though she knew it couldn't be her. The figure tilted its head, mimicking her. Then it spoke, its voice layered with an unnatural echo. "Why did you leave me, Lucy?" Lucy staggered backward, the weight of the words crashing over her. Memories flooded back. The fight with Emma, the cruel words exchanged, and the way Lucy had run off, leaving her friend alone in the woods. Tears blurred her vision as the figure loomed closer. "I didn't mean to," Lucy stammered. "I was just a kid, I didn't know." "You knew," the figure interrupted, its voice colder now, "and you left me." Before Lucy could respond, the forest erupted in whispers. The voices were everywhere, overlapping and indecipherable, yet unmistakably accusing. She turned and ran, the shadows seeming to close in around her. The laughter followed, growing louder, more twisted, until it was all she could hear. When she finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing by her cabin, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. But the whispers didn't stop. They were inside her head now, gnawing at her sanity. And the photograph she had clutched the entire time? The figure in the background was gone. Lucy spent the rest of the day barricaded inside the cabin, pacing the creaky wooden floor as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. Her hands trembled as she examined the photograph again. Emma's smiling face stared back at her, untouched by time. But the shadowy figure that had loomed in the background was gone, leaving an unsettling void where it once stood. It was as though whatever it was had stepped out of the photo and into the waking world. Night fell with a suffocating heaviness, and the whispers began again, this time louder and more insistent. They scratched at the edges of her mind like claws on a chalkboard, each one carrying fragments of a memory she didn't want to face. Lucy tried drowning them out with music, but the voices only seemed to grow louder, weaving themselves into the lyrics and melodies until the sound became unbearable. Finally, she snapped, slamming her hands against the table. "What do you want from me?" she screamed into the empty room. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. It was soft, almost polite, but in the silence of the cabin, it sounded like a gunshot. Lucy's breath hitched as she approached the door, clutching the knife she had kept within arm's reach all day. Her hands shook as she turned the handle and pulled it open. No one was there, but something had been left on the porch. A small bundle wrapped in what looked like an old piece of Emma's favorite red scarf. Lucy's stomach churned as she knelt to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the fabric. Unwrapping it revealed a collection of objects she hadn't seen in years. A friendship bracelet she and Emma had made together, a chipped ceramic heart Emma had painted for her birthday, and a single blackened tooth. Lucy staggered back, bile rising in her throat. The sight of the tooth triggered a memory she had buried deep, one that came rushing back with horrifying clarity. She was 13 again, standing in the woods with Emma. They had been playing a game of dares, a game that had turned cruel when Lucy pushed too far. "Go ahead," she had said, her voice dripping with mockery. I dare you to climb the old well, unless you're scared." Emma had tried to prove her wrong. The image of Emma's fingers slipping on the moss-covered stones, her scream as she fell into the darkness, was something Lucy had tried desperately to forget. She had run away, too terrified to call for help, too ashamed to face what she had done. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the bundle to her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was scared. I didn't mean to leave you." The whispers quieted for a moment, as if listening. Then a new sound emerged, the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps on the porch behind her. Lucy froze, her blood running cold as the air grew impossibly still. Turning slowly, she saw it. The same figure from the forest, its hollow eyes staring into hers. "You didn't come back," it said, its voice carrying both Emma's pain and something darker, something ancient. "You let me stay in the dark." Lucy's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor. "I didn't know how to save you," she cried. "I didn't know what to do." The figure tilted its head, its movements eerily childlike. "You knew enough to leave," it said, stepping closer. Its feet didn't touch the ground, and its presence seemed to drain the light from the room. Desperate, Lucy crawled backward until her back hit the wall. "Please, Emma, if you're still in there, let me fix this. Tell me how to make it right." The figure paused, its form flickering as though caught between two worlds. For a moment, Lucy thought she saw Emma's face, a glimpse of the girl she used to know, her eyes filled with tears. But the darkness returned, and the figure's voice grew colder. "You can't fix what's already broken," it said, "but you can join me." Before Lucy could react, the cabin filled with an ear-splitting roar. The walls seemed to shudder, and the lights flickered violently. The air grew thick, pressing against her chest like a vice. And then the whispers returned, louder than ever, swirling around her in a chaotic storm of voices. Lucy screamed, clutching her head as the shadows closed in, pulling her into their depths. For a moment, she thought she saw the forest again, the towering trees bending toward her like giants. And then everything went black. When Lucy awoke, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. She was lying on her back, staring up at the canopy of trees, their twisted branches forming a lattice against a starless sky. The forest around her was unrecognizable, darker, colder, and alive with the sounds of something unseen. It wasn't the same whispering pines she had grown up with. This place was wrong, a shadow of the world she knew. As she sat up, a sharp pain shot through her head, and she realized her hands were caked in dirt. She had no memory of how she'd gotten here, only flashes of the cabin, the figure, and a suffocating darkness. The whispers were gone, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It was a void, unnatural and suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of something moving through the trees. "Emma?" Lucy called out, her voice trembling. The forest responded with a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the hunting knife she still miraculously held. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she turned in every direction, searching for some semblance of escape. But the trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their trunks closing in like a maze designed to trap her. "Why are you doing this?" she shouted into the void. "What do you want from me?" From the shadows emerged the figure again, its pale form stark against the darkness. This time, it looked more human, its face unmistakably Emma's, but warped, its features flickering between the innocent child Lucy remembered and something monstrous. The sight made Lucy's chest tighten, a knot of fear and guilt twisting inside her. "You owe me, Lucy," the figure said, its voice layered with malice and sorrow. "You owe me the truth." Lucy's grip on the knife faltered. I was scared," she stammered. "I didn't know what to do. You fell, and I ran. I should have gotten help, but I didn't. I was a coward." The forest seemed to hold its breath as her confession hung in the air. The figure tilted its head, and for a moment, Lucy thought she saw something soften in its hollow eyes. But the moment passed, and the darkness around them thickened. "You left me to rot in the dark," the figure said, stepping closer. "Do you know what it's like to be forgotten? To scream and scream, but no one comes?" Tears streamed down Lucy's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have come back. I should have saved you." The figure stopped inches away from her, its cold breath chilling her skin. "Sorry isn't enough," it hissed. "You must pay." Before Lucy could react, The ground beneath her shifted, and she fell backward into a yawning pit that had opened in the earth. She tumbled into the darkness, her screams swallowed by the void. When she landed, the air was freezing and the world around her was a swirling mass of shadows and voices. She was no longer in the forest. This place was something else entirely, a realm of nightmares where the walls were made of whispers and the ground writhed beneath her feet. Figures moved in the darkness, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They reached for her, their voices a chorus of anguish and accusation. "Why didn't you save us, Lucy?" they cried. "Why did you leave?" Lucy stumbled backward, clutching her head as the voices overwhelmed her. "I didn't know how." She screamed. "I didn't mean to leave you." A figure emerged from the crowd, and Lucy's heart sank as she recognized Emma's face. But this time it was fully formed, her expression a mixture of sorrow and fury. "You could have tried," Emma said, her voice cutting through the cacophony. "But you didn't. You let the darkness take me." Lucy fell to her knees, her body racked with sobs. "Please," she begged, "tell me how to make it right. Tell me how to set you free." Emma's form flickered, her edges blurring as the darkness around her pulsed. "You can't set me free," she said, "but you can stay. Stay and bear the weight of your choices." The shadows closed in, wrapping around Lucy like tendrils. She screamed as they pulled her deeper into the abyss, her body sinking into the dark. The last thing she saw was Emma's face, watching her with a strange, haunting smile. Lucy Hart's disappearance became another story in the haunted history of Whispering Pines. Some said she had run away, unable to cope with her mother's death. Others whispered that the forest had claimed her, just as it had Emma so many years before. And on quiet nights, when the wind swept through the trees, you could still hear the laughter of two little girls playing in the woods, their voices mingling with the whispers of the pines. Aidan West had always been drawn to the mysteries of the natural world, an instinct that often led him to explore places no one else dared to go. It was on a late October evening, under a blood-red sky, that he found himself standing at the edge of the Black Hollow Woods. Known in local lore as Cursed Land, Black Hollow had long been the subject of whispered tales. People spoke of disappearances, eerie lights, and shadows that moved against logic. For Aidan, the pull was irresistible. His companions, Zara and Liam, were less enthusiastic but unwilling to let him venture alone. "You know this is a bad idea, right?" Zara's voice broke the silence as they stared into the dark, gnarled forest. Her auburn hair gleamed in the fading light, and her hazel eyes darted nervously. "They say people who go in there don't come back." "People also say the Loch Ness Monster's real," Aidan quipped, slinging his flashlight over his shoulder. "We'll be fine, it's just a bunch of trees." Liam, the practical one of the group, adjusted his backpack and muttered, "Yeah, and bodies hanging from them in the stories. Let's not forget that part." Despite his apprehension, he followed as Aidan led the way into the dense foliage. The forest welcomed them with a silence that felt alive. No rustling of leaves, no chirping crickets, just the oppressive weight of stillness. As they ventured deeper, the trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers above. The air turned colder, and the scent of damp earth filled their noses. "Did you guys hear that?" Zara stopped abruptly, her voice trembling. She pointed towards a patch of darkness to their left. Aidan shone his flashlight, but the beam seemed to be swallowed whole. Nothing moved, but the sense of being watched was palpable. "Probably just the wind," Aidan said, though his voice lacked conviction. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pressed forward. They soon stumbled upon a clearing, its center dominated by a decrepit cabin. The wood was gray with age, the windows dark and uninviting. Strange symbols were carved into the doorframe, shapes that made no sense yet evoked a deep unease. Against his better judgment, Aidan stepped closer. "This is where we turn back," Liam said, his voice firm. "No way am I going in there." "We've come this far," Aidan replied, a mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling in his chest. He reached for the doorknob, ignoring Zara's whispered protests. The door creaked open, revealing a single room filled with shadows. The air was thick with the smell of decay. At the center of the room sat an old table, and on it lay a book bound in leather, so worn it seemed part of the wood beneath it. Aiden approached, the others hesitating at the threshold. "Don't touch it," Zara hissed. "I mean it, Aiden." But he was already reaching for the book. The moment his fingers grazed its surface, the cabin seemed to exhale, a deep, rattling sound that came from everywhere and nowhere. The door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into utter darkness. The darkness inside the cabin was absolute. Aiden fumbled with his flashlight, the beam flickering weakly before extinguishing completely. Zara screamed, a short, sharp sound swallowed by the thick silence. Liam banged on the door, his panicked yells reverberating in the confined space. "It won't open," Liam shouted, his voice cracking. "We're trapped." "Calm down," Aiden snapped, though his own voice betrayed his fear. He still held the book, its surface cold and unyielding in his hands. He couldn't explain why he hadn't dropped it yet. Something about the weight of it felt alive. Then the whispers began. They were soft at first, barely audible beneath the sound of their frantic breathing. But as the seconds ticked by, the whispers grew louder, overlapping and swirling around the room. They spoke no language the group could understand, yet the tone was unmistakable. Mocking, taunting, and full of malice. "What the hell is that?" Zara pressed herself against the wall, her face pale in the dim light. "It's coming from the book," Liam said, pointing with a trembling hand. "Put it down, Aiden." But Aiden couldn't move. The whispers seemed to penetrate his mind, weaving through his thoughts and filling him with a strange compulsion. Against his will, his fingers opened the cover, revealing yellowed pages covered in strange, spidery script. The symbols twisted and writhed on the paper, as if alive. "Aiden, stop!" Zara lunged forward and tried to grab the book, but the moment her hand touched the cover, she shrieked and fell backward, clutching her arm. "What happened?" Liam rushed to her side, his eyes wide with terror. "It burned me," Zara cried, showing the red, blistered skin on her palm. "That thing's cursed." Aiden's breathing quickened as his eyes remained fixed on the pages. The whispers grew louder, forming words in his mind. "Read us." The voice was deep, insistent, and strangely soothing. Before he realized what he was doing, Aiden began to read aloud. The effect was immediate. The air in the cabin grew icy, and a gust of wind roared through the room, extinguishing even the faint light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The whispers turned to laughter, guttural and inhuman. Shadows began to creep from the corners, pooling together and rising like living smoke. "What did you do?" Liam shouted, grabbing Aiden's shoulders and shaking him. But Aiden didn't respond. His eyes were glazed, his mouth moving as though the words were being pulled from him against his will. The shadows took shape, forming figures that towered over them. Their faces were featureless, their forms shifting and flickering like flame. One stepped closer, reaching out with a tendril of darkness that wrapped around Zara's ankle. "Let me go," she screamed, kicking at the shadow, but her leg passed through it, as though it were smoke. The tendril tightened, dragging her toward the center of the room. "Zara!" Liam tried to grab her arm, but another shadow latched onto his wrist, yanking him away. Aiden remained frozen, his voice still reciting the ancient words. With a final, desperate effort, Zara hurled a nearby lantern at the shadow holding her. The glass shattered, and a burst of flame erupted, momentarily illuminating the room. The shadows recoiled, hissing like snakes, and the tendrils released their grip. "Aiden, snap out of it," Liam shouted, slapping him across the face. The blow seemed to break the spell, and Aiden stumbled backward, dropping the book. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the shadows melted back into the darkness. For a moment, the cabin was silent except for their ragged breathing. "We need to get out of here," Zara said, her voice shaking. "Now." But as they turned toward the door, it opened on its own, revealing the forest bathed in an unnatural red glow. The path they had taken to the cabin was gone, replaced by an expanse of gnarled trees that seemed to stretch endlessly. "There's no way back," Aiden said, his voice hollow. He glanced at the book on the floor, its pages fluttering despite the absence of wind. "I think it wants us to go deeper." The forest had transformed into a labyrinth of impossibility. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground beneath Aiden, Zara, and Liam was no longer dirt, but a network of tangled roots, pulsating faintly as if alive. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic tang of blood. A low hum vibrated through the woods, growing louder with each step they took. "What is this place?" Zara whispered, her voice trembling. Her earlier courage had been replaced with sheer terror. "It's not the same forest," Liam replied, glancing nervously over his shoulder. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. It's alive." Aiden led the way, gripping the flashlight tightly though its beam barely penetrated the darkness. He hadn't picked the book back up, but its presence lingered, a weight in his mind that refused to dissipate. He could still hear the whispers faintly, coaxing him forward. "This way. Come to us." "Why are we even moving?" Liam asked, his voice rising. "We should stay put, wait for sunrise, or—" "Sunrise isn't coming," Aiden interrupted, his tone eerily calm. "Don't you see? Time doesn't work here." Zara and Liam exchanged worried glances, but neither could argue. The red glow that suffused the forest had no source, no beginning or end. The very concept of night and day seemed irrelevant in this place. After what felt like hours, they reached another clearing. At its center stood a towering tree unlike any they had seen before. Its bark was blackened, and its branches stretched skyward in a jagged, unnatural formation. Hanging from its limbs were dozens of objects. Ropes tied in nooses, shattered mirrors, and scraps of blood-stained cloth. At its base was a crude altar, carved from bone and stone, glowing faintly with the same red light that suffused the forest. "What the hell is this?" Zara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She took a cautious step back, her eyes fixed on the altar. "It's calling us," Aiden said, his gaze locked on the tree. He stepped forward as if in a trance. "Aiden, no." Liam grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "You don't get to decide for all of us. We need to figure out how to get out of here, not whatever this is." "We can't leave," Aiden replied, his voice distant. "Not until we finish what was started." "What are you talking about?" Zara demanded, shaking him. "This isn't you. Snap out of it." Before Aiden could respond, the ground beneath the altar began to tremble. A fissure opened, and from it emerged a figure cloaked in shadows, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness surrounding it. The figure had no eyes, only deep, hollow sockets that seemed to suck in all light. "Welcome," the figure intoned, its voice a chorus of overlapping whispers. "You have come far." Zara and Liam backed away, but Aiden stood his ground, his body rigid. The figure turned its hollow gaze toward him. "You have brought the words," it said. "Speak them, and the pact will be complete." "What is it talking about?" Zara asked, her voice frantic. "Aiden, don't listen to it." But Aiden's expression was blank, his lips already forming the ancient words he had read from the book. As the first syllables escaped his mouth, the figure began to grow, its form expanding and solidifying. The air around them grew colder, the red glow intensifying. "Stop him," Liam shouted, lunging at Aiden. But before he could reach him, the figure raised a hand, and Liam was thrown backward by an invisible force. He hit the ground hard, gasping for air. "Aiden, please," Zara cried, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed his arm, shaking him violently. "This isn't you!" "Fight it." For a moment, Aiden's gaze flickered, the trance breaking, but the figure's voice boomed, filling the clearing. "The pact must be fulfilled. You have no choice, mortal." "I'm sorry," Aiden whispered, his voice cracking. He tore himself from Zara's grip and continued speaking the ancient words. The ground shook violently, and the tree began to twist and writhe as though in pain. The nooses and mirrors hanging from its branches snapped and shattered, their fragments scattering across the clearing. The figure began to laugh, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Shadows spilled from its form, spreading through the forest like a dark tide. Liam struggled to his feet, his voice hoarse. "We have to stop this. There has to be a way." Zara's eyes darted to the altar, then back to the tree. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the meaning of the symbols and the strange energy surrounding them. "It's the book," she said suddenly. "The book is the key. If we destroy it—" "It won't let us," Liam interrupted, glancing at the shadows creeping closer. "We have to try." The shadows closed in, writhing like a living tide, their tendrils lashing out toward the three friends. The laughter of the shadow figure grew deafening, reverberating through the clearing like thunder. Aiden stood frozen at the altar, his lips still forming the cursed words as Zara and Liam scrambled for a solution. Zara's gaze locked onto the book, lying on the ground where Aiden had dropped it earlier. The pages fluttered violently, as though caught in an invisible wind. "We have to destroy it," she screamed over the cacophony. "How?" Liam shouted, dodging a tendril of shadow that whipped past his head. Zara's mind raced. "Fire. Fire is the only thing that can cleanse it." Liam's eyes darted to the shattered lantern lying nearby. Though most of the oil had spilled out, a small puddle remained, glistening faintly in the eerie red light. "I'll do it," he yelled, crawling toward the lantern while dodging the encroaching shadows. As Liam reached for the lantern, one of the shadow tendrils wrapped around his leg, pulling him back. He screamed, his hands clawing at the ground. Zara dashed forward, grabbing a thick branch and swinging it at the tendril. To her surprise, it recoiled, releasing Liam and hissing like a snake. "Hurry," she urged, pulling him to his feet. Liam grabbed the lantern, dipped the branch into the remaining oil, and ignited it with a trembling hand. The makeshift torch flared to life, its light momentarily holding the shadows at bay. He turned to Zara. "Get the book. I'll keep them off you." Zara nodded, her heart pounding. She darted toward the book, the shadows swarming around her like a nest of angry serpents. The whispers grew louder, piercing her mind with promises of power, knowledge, and escape. Her steps faltered as the seductive voices tugged at her resolve. "Don't listen to them," Liam shouted, waving the torch to keep the shadows at bay. "They're lying." Gritting her teeth, Zara pushed forward and snatched the book. The instant her fingers closed around it, the shadows surged, converging on her with a ferocity that knocked her to the ground. She screamed, the weight of the darkness crushing her chest. "Zara!" Liam charged forward, swinging the torch wildly. The flames drove the shadows back just enough for him to pull her to her feet. "You've got to burn it now." Zara stumbled toward the altar, where Aiden stood, his face pale and his eyes glassy. The shadow figure loomed above him, its form now towering and monstrous, its laughter shaking the very earth. "You cannot stop what has begun," it roared. "The pact is eternal." Aiden's lips trembled, and for the briefest moment his voice faltered. His gaze met Zara's, and she saw a flicker of the old Aiden, the one who had been her closest friend, her confidant, and the heart of their group. "Aiden, fight it," she pleaded, holding the book high. "You don't have to do this. You can stop it." Tears streamed down Aiden's face. "I can't," he whispered. "It won't let me." "Yes, you can." Zara stepped closer, the torchlight illuminating the raw anguish in his eyes. "You're stronger than it. You're stronger than this place." For a moment, the whispers receded, and Aiden took a shuddering breath. "Burn it," he said, his voice barely audible. "Burn it now." Without hesitation, Zara hurled the book onto the altar. Liam thrust the torch into the pile, and flames erupted, consuming the ancient tome in an instant. The red glow of the forest dimmed as the shadow figure let out a deafening roar, its form writhing and shrinking. The ground beneath them trembled violently, cracks splintering through the clearing. The tree at the center of the altar began to collapse, its branches crumbling to ash. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the fissure from which they had come. The figure let out one final guttural scream before imploding into nothingness, leaving only silence in its wake. The forest returned to its natural state, the oppressive red light replaced by the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. The air felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. The three friends stood in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. "We did it," Liam said, his voice hoarse. He looked at Zara, then at Aiden, who had collapsed to his knees. Zara knelt beside Aiden, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Aiden nodded weakly, his face pale but his eyes clear. I think so. Thank you." The three of them stumbled out of the clearing, the forest strangely calm. When they finally reached the edge, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. They turned back to look at the woods one last time, the memories of what had happened etched into their minds. "Do you think it's over?" Liam asked, his voice tinged with both hope and fear. Zara looked at Aiden, then at the forest. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But whatever it was, it won't forget us." The three friends walked away, leaving Black Hollow behind. But as they disappeared into the morning light, a faint whisper echoed from the depths of the forest, carrying with it a chilling promise. This is not the end. The summer air hung thick as Lena adjusted her backpack, its weight pressing into her shoulders like the unease settling in her gut. She glanced at her friends. Mia, sarcastic but steadfast, Ethan, always ready with a joke, and Jake, whose quiet confidence had a way of grounding the group. The four had been inseparable since high school, but this trip, a weekend camping deep in Pine Hollow Woods, felt different. The forest was a notorious local legend, a place whispered about in hushed tones, warning of eerie disappearances and unnatural sounds. "This is going to be epic," Ethan said, swatting a mosquito off his arm. "We'll have a killer story to tell at the bar next week." "If we survive," Mia quipped, adjusting her camera strap. "This place practically screams found footage horror." "Relax," Jake said, his voice steady. "It's just a forest. Stories are just stories." But as the group ventured deeper into the woods, the world seemed to shift. The sunlight barely pierced the canopy, leaving everything in a dim green haze. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. The trail narrowed, forcing them to walk single file, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They reached their campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan immediately set to work building a fire, while Jake unpacked the tent. Mia wandered off with her camera, mumbling about capturing authentic creep factor. Lena stayed close to the fire, her eyes scanning the darkening forest. As night fell, the fire cast flickering shadows across their faces. Stories started, each trying to outdo the last. Mia shared a tale about ghostly apparitions, Ethan retold a gruesome urban legend, and Jake added his own twist to a local myth. When it was Lena's turn, she hesitated. "My grandmother used to say Pine Hollow Woods were cursed," Lena began, her voice low. "She said it's not the trees or the animals, it's the land itself. She called it the echo. Said it takes people who don't belong and traps them forever." A rustling sound cut through the night, freezing them mid-laughter. Jake shone his flashlight toward the noise, revealing nothing but dense underbrush. "Probably just a raccoon," Ethan said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. The group laughed nervously, but the atmosphere had shifted. As they turned in for the night, Lena lay awake in the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and something else. Faint whispers that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. When the whispers turned into faint giggles, Lena bolted upright. "Jake? Mia? Did you hear that?" Her friends were sound asleep, but as she stared into the blackness beyond the tent's mesh window, she could have sworn she saw movement, something pale weaving through the trees. The morning brought little relief to Lena's unease. The forest was eerily quiet, as if the world had hit mute. Even Ethan, usually the life of the group, seemed subdued as he poked at the embers of the previous night's fire. "Anyone else have weird dreams?" Mia asked, flipping through the photos on her camera. Her tone was casual, but her furrowed brow betrayed her. "I didn't sleep enough to dream," Lena muttered, glancing at Jake, who was studying the map. "Did you hear anything last night? Like voices?" Jake looked up, his expression unreadable. "Probably just the wind. These woods play tricks on your senses." Ethan scoffed. "Great, now the forest has a sense of humor. Let's just hike to that lake and chill for the day." The group packed up and headed deeper into the woods, following a narrow trail that Jake swore led to a secluded lake. But as they walked, the trees grew denser, their gnarled roots clawing at the ground like skeletal fingers. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, its branches twisting unnaturally, as if leaning in to eavesdrop. They arrived at the lake by midday. Its surface was unnervingly still, a glassy black that reflected the trees like a distorted mirror. Ethan, undeterred, stripped off his shirt and cannonballed into the water, sending ripples across the surface. "Come on, guys," he called, splashing. "The water's perfect." Jake hesitated, but Mia, always competitive, tossed her camera onto her bag and waded in. Lena stayed on the shore, her arms crossed. She stared at the water, its unnatural stillness sending a chill down her spine. "Lena, you coming?" Jake asked, standing beside her. She shook her head. "Something feels off." Jake sighed, but before he could respond, Ethan let out a sudden scream. It wasn't playful, it was primal, a sound ripped from deep within. He thrashed in the water, his arms flailing. "Help! Something's got me!" he shouted, his voice breaking. Jake dove in without hesitation, swimming toward Ethan. Mia scrambled out of the water, her face pale. Lena froze, watching as Jake reached Ethan and dragged him to the shore. "What happened?" Jake demanded as Ethan gasped for breath, clutching his leg. "It felt like hands," Ethan stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "Cold, bony hands pulling me under." Jake examined Ethan's leg, revealing deep red marks that looked eerily like finger-shaped bruises. "That's it. We're leaving," Mia said, grabbing her camera. "I don't care if we have to hike all night." But as they packed up their things, Lena noticed something chilling. The ripples Ethan had made in the water were gone, but the surface wasn't still. It was trembling, as if something beneath was watching them. The hike back to camp was tense, the oppressive silence of the forest amplifying every crunch of leaves and snap of twigs. Ethan hobbled along with Jake's help, his face pale, his legs still throbbing where the bruises formed. Mia walked ahead, her camera clutched tightly in her hands, her usual sarcastic remarks replaced with nervous glances over her shoulder. "What's the plan?" Lena asked Jake quietly. "We're not staying another night, are we?" Jake shook his head. "We'll pack up as soon as we get back. We can hike out tonight." As they reached the clearing, they stopped dead in their tracks. The campsite was unrecognizable. Their tent was collapsed, its poles bent at unnatural angles. Their belongings were scattered across the ground, torn and shredded as if by claws. The fire pit, which they had carefully built, was filled with water, its stones blackened and cracked. This isn't normal," Mia said, her voice trembling. She began snapping photos, but her hands were shaking so badly the camera nearly slipped from her grip. Ethan collapsed onto a log, burying his face in his hands. "What is happening here?" he muttered, his voice breaking. "This place is messed up." "It's not just the place," Lena said, her voice low. "It's something in the woods, it's watching us." Jake knelt by the fire pit, his expression dark. "We're not waiting around to find out what did this. Pack whatever you can carry, we're leaving now." As they scrambled to gather their scattered belongings, the forest seemed to close in around them. The sunlight faded unnaturally fast, plunging the clearing into shadow, and then the whispers began again. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible. But as the group stood frozen, the whispers grew louder, their cadence rising and falling like a sinister chant. Words were impossible to discern, but the tone was unmistakable, malevolent, mocking. "Do you hear that?" Ethan whispered, his eyes darting to the tree line. Lena nodded, her chest tightening. "It's them. The echo." Jake stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "We don't have time for this. Everyone stick together. We're heading back to the main trail." The group moved as one, huddled close as they left the clearing, but the whispers followed, weaving through the trees, growing louder with each step. The path seemed to twist and change beneath their feet, the familiar trail now a maze of identical pines. Suddenly Mia stopped, her camera aimed at the trees. "There's something out there," she said, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, stepping beside her. Mia zoomed in, her lens capturing a pale, humanoid figure standing between the trees. Its face was obscured, but its elongated limbs and unnatural stillness sent a shiver down her spine. "It's watching us," Mia said, stepping back. "Oh my God, it's watching us." Without warning, the figure darted out of view, its movement unnaturally fast. The group broke into a run, their breath ragged as they stumbled through the underbrush. The whispers turned into laughter, cruel and echoing, as if the forest itself was mocking their fear. "Keep going," Jake shouted, his voice strained. "Don't look back." But Lena couldn't resist. She glanced over her shoulder and saw them, figures, dozens of them, pale and spectral, emerging from the trees. Their hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul as they reached out with impossibly long fingers. The forest seemed alive as the group stumbled through the trees, the pale figures closing in from every direction. The laughter had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by their frantic breathing and the crunch of dead leaves underfoot. Lena's chest burned, her legs aching, but fear propelled her forward. "This way," Jake called, pointing toward a faint glow in the distance. It wasn't the golden light of a sunrise, but it was their only hope. The glow grew brighter as they ran, revealing a clearing unlike any they'd seen before. At its center stood a massive, gnarled tree with roots that sprawled like veins across the earth. The glow emanated from the tree itself, its bark pulsating with an otherworldly light. "What the hell is this?" Ethan gasped, collapsing onto the ground. His leg throbbed, the bruises now a deep, angry purple. "It's the heart of the forest," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain. "This is where it all comes from." The pale figures stopped at the edge of the clearing, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. They didn't advance, but their presence was suffocating, as if the air itself had turned against them. "We have to destroy it," Jake said, grabbing a fallen branch. "The tree, it's the source." Mia shook her head, stepping back. "We don't know what will happen if we do. What if it makes things worse?" "Worse than this?" Jake snapped, gesturing to the figures encircling them. Lena approached the tree cautiously, her heart pounding. As she placed her hand on the bark, a flood of images filled her mind. Faces of people, their expressions frozen in terror, trapped in the forest's grasp. They weren't just echoes. They were victims, drawn into the woods and consumed. "It's them," Lena said, turning to the others. "The people who disappeared. They're trapped here. The tree is feeding on them." Ethan struggled to his feet, wincing. "Then we burn it down. End this nightmare." Jake nodded, using his flashlight to ignite the dry leaves at the base of the tree. The flames caught quickly, climbing the bark and illuminating the clearing in an orange glow. The figures at the edge of the clearing began to wail, their hollow voices rising in a haunting symphony of despair. As the fire consumed the tree, the ground beneath them trembled. The pale figures dissolved into mist, their wails fading into silence. The oppressive weight that had hung over the forest lifted, and the glow of the tree dimmed until it was gone. The group stood in stunned silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. The forest was still, the air fresh and clean for the first time. "Is it over?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded, though a lingering unease coiled in her chest. "I think so." They didn't wait to find out. The group retraced their steps, the trail now clear and familiar. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. As they stepped onto the road, Ethan looked back one last time. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" "No," Jake said, his voice heavy. "But that doesn't matter, we're alive." They piled into their car and drove away, the weight of their ordeal sinking in. But as they left Pine Hollow Woods behind, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped entirely. The whispers still echoed faintly in her mind, a haunting reminder that the forest never truly lets go.